The geomagnetic field and the origin of life. Because no one has yet produced life in the laboratory, the origin of life, scientifically referred to as biogenesis, is a subject for speculation only. While there are many theories, all require the introduction of energy in some form to accomplish the initial steps in this evolutionary process. Lightning, geothermal energy, and sunlight are favorite candidates for this role. However, if one speculates on the status of the Earth's magnetic field in the Precambrian era when life first appeared, some intriguing alternatives may be developed. Basing their ideas on our current knowledge of the atmospheric composition and the status of the geomagnetic field during that time, Professors E. Cole of Louisiana State University and Ernst R. Graf of Auburn University have proposed that the magnetic micropulsations would not have been micro, but instead would have been of very great strength. The extra low frequency of 10 cycles per second would have been particularly strong, perhaps even strong enough to cause the induction of large electrical currents and lightning at the same frequency. Cole and Graf postulated that this energy could have been used to bring together the initial biological molecules, such as the proteins. It followed that the structures of these chemicals would then have been resonant at 10 cycles per second, and that all living organisms that developed later would have shown a sensitivity to this frequency. This indeed appears to be the case among present-day aquatic animals that are electrosensitive, such as sharks, catfish, electric eels, and even that strange mammal, the platypus. However, this theory does not explain the biggest problem faced by researchers in biogenesis. All complex organic chemicals can exist in two mirror image structural forms, a right-hand one and a left-hand one. The amino acids and sugars that make up proteins and other important biochemicals such as DNA are one type in all living organisms. We can make amino acids and sugars in test tubes from simpler chemicals, but we always get a 50-50 mix of right-hand and left-hand ones. Somehow, when living things originally made their amino acids and sugars as structural units of their bodies, they made only one kind. This is very important because we must have only right hand or only left hand molecules in order to make a protein or DNA that will work correctly. How living things originally performed this trick is unknown because the Greek word for hand is chiros. The problem is referred to as as the Churalty problem. Recently, Doctors W. Thyman and U. Jarzak of the University of Bremen reported that in using a magnetic technique, they were able to generate either all right-hand or all left-hand forms of a number of organic molecules. It is therefore possible that a unique magnetic field of Precambrian Earth caused the initial production of only right-hand or left-hand molecules from simple chemicals, making it possible for life to begin. The geomagnetic field in life today. The ancient idea that there are universal forces governing human affairs does have a basis in reality. Instead of gods and spirits, modern science has substituted electromagnetic fields, but the results are strikingly similar. The natural geomagnetic field is a complex structure resulting from the interaction between the simple magnetic field of the Earth and the energy that pours from the sun. It contains vast stores of the energy and demonstrates reliably daily fluctuations in its strength as well as longer periodic changes. In addition, it is subject to sudden massive storms produced by energetic events on the sun. Over geologic time, it exhibits strange reversals of polarity. All of these energetic changes have biologic effects of great importance. Magnetic storms appear to have a direct effect on operations of the human brain. Magnetic reversals in the geologic past may have been the engine driving the evolutionary process, and the ancient geomagnetic field of the Precambrian era may have played a role in the origin of life. As we have seen, the geomagnetic field is a shield protecting the Earth from the full force of the sun's energy. Without it, life could not exist. But since humanity has learned how to generate and manipulate electromagnetic forces, we have created other forces beneath this shield, the likes of which have never been before existed. Chapter 8 and 11 will deal with the bioeffects of these unnatural electromagnetic fields. Chapter 8, Man-Made Electromagnetic Fields. Of the great construction projects of the last century, none has been more impressive in its technical, economic, and scientific aspect. None has been more influential in its social effects, and none has engaged more thoroughly our constructive instincts and capabilities than the electric power system. A great network of power lines which will forever order the way in which we live is now superimposed on the industrial world. Thomas P. Hughes, Networks of Power. Our modern world began a little over 100 years ago when Thomas Edison first demonstrated his electric lamp. By 1882, he had set up for the first central generating station at Pearl Street in New York City, which provided about 1/6 of a square mile of downtown Manhattan with electric power for lights. Edison's system transmitted low voltage DC current and was limited to short distance transmission. At about the same time, Nikola Tesla invented and developed the alternating current system, which was capable of transmitting far greater amounts of power over much longer distances. By 1894, Tesla's generators at Niagara Falls were supplying the city of Buffalo with electric power. 4 years later, an AC transmission line was operating at 30,000 volts between Santa Ana and Los Angeles, a distance of 75 miles. Tesla's AC system is now the one most commonly used around the world. It operates at either 50 or 60 cycles per second, 50 hertz or 60 hertz, frequencies that are not present in the normal electromagnetic spectrum of the Earth. A few years after Edison's electric lamp demonstrated, Heinrich Hertz, a young professor of physics in Germany, demonstrated that an electrical spark jumping across a gap would produce a spark at another, yet similar gap a few feet away without being directly connected. While Galvani had observed the same thing 100 years before, his observation had been totally forgotten. Subsequently, physicists had pronounced that producing action at a distance, that is, producing a change at one place by making a change at another place without a direct connection between the two, was impossible. Therefore, before Hertz's time, it was believed that electricity could be transmitted from one place to another only by means of a connecting wire. Hertz was also able to demonstrate that the electromagnetic energy produced by the spark gap was composed of oscillations or waves that were part of a much greater electromagnetic spectrum than included visible light. His experiments confirmed the mathematical theory of James Clerk Maxwell, an English physicist who had predicted exactly such a spectrum of continuously increasing frequencies of electromagnetic energy. In honor of Hertz's contributions, the units of frequency of electromagnetic energy are referred to by his name. Hertz's apparatus was crude by our standards, but only a few years later, in 1901, it led to Marconi's transmission of the letter S across the Atlantic Ocean. Shortly thereafter, the spark gaps were replaced by vacuum tubes, and in 1918, a message was transmitted by radio from England to Australia, a distance of 11,000 miles. By the late 1920s, commercial radio transmissions had become almost commonplace, and electrical power of up to 220,000 volts was being transmitted over distances of hundreds of miles by means of Tesla's AC method. The 20th century was off to a flying start, and our society would be shaped and molded by the incredible power of electromagnetism. Today, the economy of every developed nation depends upon its electric power network. The world is tied together by electronic communication systems that transmit enormous volumes of information practically instantaneously. Such uses of electromagnetic energy are often referred to as our greatest achievement, a triumph of technology that has led to the betterment of society. There is, however, another side to this technology, and that is the subject of this chapter. Our abnormal electromagnetic environment. Our use of energy for power and communications has radically changed the total electromagnetic field of the Earth. Because we cannot directly perceive this with any of our senses, most of us are unaware that this has occurred. Before 1900, the Earth's electromagnetic field was composed simply of the field and its associated micropulsations, visible light, and random discharges of lightning. Today, we swim in a sea of energy that is almost totally man-made. This change from natural electrical and magnetic environment in which life began and evolved into the electromagnetic jungle that now surrounds us has profound implications for energy medicine. If we sense and derive information from the natural geomagnetic field, it is possible that this unnatural field is producing biological effects that may be harmful. Over the past 50 years, we have more than duplicated the changes in frequencies and strength of the micropulsations that may have been associated with the past species die-outs, as explained in the last chapter. Our artificial reversal is much greater in extent and has occurred in much shorter period of time than any natural occurring reversal. The scientific evidence that will be reviewed in this chapter leads to the only one conclusion. The exposure of living organisms to abnormal electromagnetic fields results in significant abnormalities in physiology and function. The growth of electric power and communication systems was slow at first, but since World War II, it has been increasing at between 5 and 10% per year. In addition, new technologies have appeared. Commercial telephone and television satellite transmitters and relays blanket the Earth from 25,000 miles out into space. Military satellites cruise by every point on Earth once an hour, and from their altitude of only 250 miles, they bounce radar beams off its surface to produce images for later downloading over their home countries. New TV and FM stations come on air weekly. The industry has placed in the hands of the public such gadgets as citizen band radios and cellular telephones. Engineers propose gigantic solar power stations in space, which would relay the electrical energy to Earth by means of enormous, powerful microwave beams. Electrical power transmission lines are operating at millions of volts and thousands of amperes of current. Military services of every country use all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum for communications and surveillance, and the use of electromagnetic energy as the anti-personnel weapon is being studied. The list goes on and on. We have now almost reached a state in which the entire electromagnetic spectrum has been filled up with man-made frequencies. Our electric power systems operate at 50 or 60 times per second, just above the highest naturally occurring frequency of 30 hertz. Our microwave beams operate at billions of times per second and are getting ever closer to the trillion cycle frequencies of visible light. We have filled the previously empty electromagnetic spectrum between these two extremes with man-made radiation that never before existed on Earth, and we did it in less than 80 years. There are many indices that could be used to show our every increasing use of this energy. Global electric power consumption, average transmitting line voltage, number of radio transmitters of all types, and so on, are rising, some at frightening rates. This technological innovation has been considered essential for the advancement of civilization. We can enjoy the advantages of the light switch on the wall and instant access to the news around the world without giving a thought to how these feats are accomplished. The fact is that every power line and an electrical appliance produces an electromagnetic field that radiates out from it. And every radio and TV signal that our devices receive has gotten there by means of a similar field given off by transmitting station. This has resulted in the unseen contamination of our environment with electromagnetic fields of frequencies and powers that never before existed on this planet. Each electromagnetic field produced by our devices contains energy. The TV pictures on the receivers in our living rooms are produced by the conversion of the energy of the signal given off by the transmitter into electrical energy in the antennas. As we sit watching TV, our bodies are receiving the same energy as well as the energy from all other TV stations and from the FM and AM radio stations, shortwave transmitters, radar devices, electric power, transmission lines, and more. At the present time, there is no place on Earth that is free from this electromagnetic contamination. The question of health hazards. The explosive growth in our use of electric power has occurred with few questions being asked about the safety of living things exposed to these abnormal fields. It was simply assumed that the laws of physics guaranteed that there could be no interaction between unseen fields and living things. When questions of safety arose, the questioner was placed in the position of seeming to be irrationally against progress. However, the reason that questions of safety arose that despite the theory's biological effects were noticed. In 1928, the General Electric plant in Schenectady, New York, was building an experimental radio transmitter that was to use the highest frequency possible of that time, about 27 megahertz. The workers at the plant began to complain of feeling vaguely ill, and Dr. Helen Hosmer of Albany Medical College was called in to investigate. She found that workers' body temperatures increased as much as 2 degrees Fahrenheit following an exposure to the transmitter field of only 15 minutes. In her report, she advised caution in exposing humans to such fields before completing investigation had been done. However, the general medical community looked at this phenomenon in a different light. At that time, fever was considered to be a good reaction to infection and injury. Possibility of artificially inducing fever or heating localized parts of the body by this method was attractive. Within 2 years, radio wave therapeutic devices, diathermy, were in use and were claimed to be valuable for the treatment of a wide variety of conditions. To the public then, the technology for producing radio transmissions was not only exciting and useful in everyday life, but could also be used in medical applications. Obviously, it could not be harmful. The only undesirable side effect noted with radiotherapy were those associated with fever, such as sweating, weakness, nausea, and dizziness. All of these symptoms quickly disappeared when patients were allowed to cool off, and no one looked for any long-term effects. During the 1930s, the use of this technology for a wide variety of conditions, including injuries, arthritis, migraine, headaches, sinusitis, and cancer, increased greatly. Today, diathermy is still used, but for far fewer conditions, not because of the recognition of any harmful effect, but because it has shown to be of little value for migraine, sinusitis, and cancer. The history of microwave fields and their biological effects. One of the great secrets of World War II was the discovery of the method for generating much higher radio frequencies than had been possible before. This permitted the development of radar, which played a major role in the ultimate victory of the Allied forces. Early in the use of radar by the U.S. Navy operating personnel noted the familiar symptoms of body heating similar to those who had been observed with the 27 megahertz radio transmitter at General Electric some years before. Since that effect had been shown to be medically useful as a therapy for various diseases, the heating produced by much higher frequency radar was pronounced harmless. However, since microwave radiation was much more powerful than those lower frequencies in prior use, concerns arose over the exposure of operating personnel because the heating effects could theoretically be much greater. In 1942, the Navy did first long-term study, medically examined 45 radar operators for a year. Nothing more than usual symptoms from body heating was found. A second study done in 1945 reached the same conclusion and stated that the heating effect was of the same magnitude as that used in high frequency therapy. In the 1940s, it was already well known that chronic exposure to heat, such as the operating in a blast furnace, produced cataracts, a clouding of the lens of the eye. Therefore, the lens of the eye appeared to be more susceptible to heat than any other part of the body. And the question of cataract formation from the chronic exposure to the microwave radiation was raised. The initial studies of this possibility were done at the Northwestern University immediately following World War II. These studies involve short-term exposure of the eyes of animals to high-power microwaves, following by an intermediate examination of the eye. No pathological effects were found, and it was concluded that the exposure to microwaves could not produce cataracts. However, studies done in that same year by the Dr. A.W. Richardson and his colleagues at State University of Iowa revealed that if the original scientists had waited 3 days to look at the animals following the microwave exposure, they would have found early signs of cataract formation. Worse yet, when an Iowa group used smaller non-heat producing doses of microwave power spread over a few days, the animals developed cataracts 42 days later. Since the multiple lower power doses of microwave did not produce heating of the lens, it was concluded that microwaves could produce cataracts by means of non-thermal effect. Even more disturbing, these results indicated that there could be latent effects of microwave exposure, which only became evident much later after exposures had ceased. While neither of these observations could explain physically, biologically, they did occur. These reports were only taken to indicate the need for further research, and between 1950 and the mid-1970s, an impressive number of studies were done on microwave cataracts. The majority of these studies were funded and controlled by the military and were quite obviously designed to show that microwave cataracts were produced by the heating effect. It was not until early 1970s that a sufficient number of valid studies were done without funding. These clearly indicated that chronic exposures to non-thermal levels of microwave caused latent cataracts. Evidently, living organisms did not work in the way that many physicists and engineers insisted they should. In 1973, two Swedish investigators, Drs. E.R.L. and B. Tengroth, reported that a survey of workers in a factory where microwave equipment was tested had shown a significant number of clinical cataracts and, more importantly, evidence for direct damage to the nerve elements of the retina. In 1988, a Robert Burge of Carnegie Mellon University reported that non-thermal microwave radiation could cause a change in the light-sensitive chemicals in the retina. Burge noted that this change was accompanied by the total absorption of the microwave radiation. It was suggested that stealth-type aircraft could be made totally invisible to radar by being coated with similar chemicals. Because details of this project are now classified, further information is available even though the medical implications are far more serious than the production of cataracts. Because there was a valid physical reason for cataracts to have been caused by the heating effect of microwave radiation, the majority of research was devoted to this aspect. The possibility that non-thermal microwave exposure could produce the same thing was largely neglected because lack of physical theory. However, during the same period, from the late 1940s to the 1960s, other more significant biological effects of microwave exposure were reported. In 1953, Dr. John McLaughlin, a medical officer for the Hughes Aircraft Corporation, reported to his employer that he identified between 75 and 100 cases of unexplained bleeding tendency, as well as significant excess of leukemia and brain tumors among Hughes workers exposed to low-strength microwaves. The corporation believed that it did not have the resources to investigate these potential problems. And since most of the microwave work was on military contracts, it turned the matter over to the military. A few years later, after McLaughlin's report, Doctors J.H. Heller and A.A. Teixeira Pinto of the New England Medical Research Institute reported that the British journal Nature that a short exposure to pulse 27 megahertz radio frequency fields produced chromosomal abnormalities in the cells of the growing root tips of garlic plants. This was the same frequency that had been allocated to the medical profession for the use of in radiotherapy, and the study was ruthlessly criticized. 10 years later, observations of these two researchers were confirmed by Dr. David E. Janes and his colleagues at the FDA. Since then, others have reported finding the same effect at non-thermal levels. The first thermal effects safety standard. These reports of non-thermal effects were ignored despite their obvious importance, and the military continued to dominate the field with the thermal effects only concept. However, some safety standards still had to be developed for the thermal effects. On the basis of theoretical calculations, it was postulated that microwave exposure at a dose of 100 milliwatts of power to an area of 1 square centimeter of body surface would exceed the ability of the blood circulation to carry away the heat produced, and local tissue heating would occur. In 1957, after applying a safety factor of 10, the military adopted a standard for exposure to microwaves of 10 milliwatts per square centimeter. In 1966, the American National Standards Institute accepted the same standard for recommended civilian occupation exposure. The 10 milliwatt centimeter squared standard became graven in stone, and for a long time the establishment resisted any efforts to dispute it. Researchers who reported hazardous bioeffects with microwave exposures at levels below the standard were ignored or ridiculed, and their research funds withdrawn. Nevertheless, the controversy continued, with many independent scientists insisting that exposure to non-thermal levels of microwaves produced major biological effects. The military responded by referring to studies done by their scientists and insisting that biological effects of non-thermal microwave exposure were physically impossible.